Chairman of the Crawford Fund, the Honourable John Anderson AC, the Honourable Minister Murray Watt for Agriculture and Fisheries, board members of the Crawford Fund, past and present, and the CEO, Dr. Colin Charteris. Allow me to also acknowledge my ACIAR colleagues, the commissioners and policy advisory members, and in particular, Fiona, great to see you, a huge champion of agriculture, and you keep the farmers in this country on their toes, I know. I'd like to also acknowledge Sue McCluskey, who was a special representative for the Australian agriculture. Professor Andrew Campbell, Nimbula Vinaka, Dr. John Balliere, the Regional Director of ACIAR, scientists and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, and a particular warm greeting to all the conference scholars. You'll forgive me if I keep clearing my throat, I'm just getting over the flu. Firstly, let me acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay respect to those who have come before us, to those who remain with us and those who are emerging. I acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, your homeland, your journey and your traditions. And in my tradition, the land is also paramount. It is the vanua, and it represents the heart of wellness, identity, and it has physical, social and cultural dimensions. And so I pay tribute to the Indigenous people of this country and acknowledge your vanua. May I also greet my colleagues from the Blue Pacific, Nimbula Vinaka, Talu Falava, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you to our hosts, the Crawford Fund, for the very privileged invitation to present the 2022 Sir John Crawford Memorial Address this evening. And I'm really delighted to be here in this place, in this building, the heart of your democracy. It is an auspicious time. We are on the cusp of a new beginning now, that the pandemic clouds seem to be moving along and the turmoil of the past several years has actually started to clear. In fact, I think we could almost be forgiven for feeling a little giddy, as it's been so long since we've been together and been able to connect physically. As we step forward into the bright future for agriculture this evening, I'd like to first congratulate the Crawford Fund, which this year is celebrating its 35th anniversary. 35 years of progress as a reliable partner in building a brighter future in agriculture, globally promoting the vision for a better world through collaboration and training. Your efforts have indeed been felt in the Pacific. I should also mention that this year is also ACIAR's 40th birthday, and I was very pleased to be able to join that celebration earlier this year. And I think these important birthday milestones tell you that Australia has had for many years made a significant contribution to the global landscape of agriculture. So trying to summarise all the challenges and achievements in agriculture for a region as vast as the Pacific is an almost insurmountable task. The peoples and nations that make up our ocean continent are as unique and diverse as the stars in the sky. However, I do believe there are a few commonalities which can help guide us. And tonight I'd like to speak about 5 of them. 5 issues to discuss and kindle a fire for, 5 challenges that could turn discussion into action, 5 signposts that can help us map out a way to a more sustainable future in our region. So allow me to start at where we see ourselves as the Blue Continent. You will never know how far you must travel unless you know where you are starting from. So to begin, I want to focus on taking a small snapshot at the state of agriculture in the Pacific today. Along with the beauty of the Pacific comes the harsh reality of environmental challenges, changes, biodiversity loss, cyclones, natural disasters, pandemics, and economic pressures and shocks. Most recently, the eruption of the Hunga Tonga Ha'apai volcano, one of the largest recorded in this region, spewed ash and adversity throughout the islands of Tonga, requiring rebuilding of entire communities and destroying the entire agricultural and crop sector of Tongatapu. A few minutes of a natural event destroyed decades of development. And let's not forget the 2016 devastating Cyclone Winston, from which Fiji is still rebuilding 4 years on. The journey to recovery from the impact of this particular cyclone is likely to take many years. And of course, there are many other powerful cyclones which have been wreaking havoc across the Pacific since then. There is now, of course, the ongoing impact of COVID-19, from which we are still slowly emerging, that has left communities and economies across the region completely ravaged. And now we are feeling the impact of issues happening halfway around the world as the war in Ukraine has helped trigger rapid inflation of basic goods, from fuel to grain, including agricultural inputs. What we have learnt and understood more clearly through the COVID and Ukraine disruptions is how dependent and therefore vulnerable our agricultural sector is on external inputs and the fossil fuel industry. So hanging over all of this is the more rapidly changing climate, leading to sea level rise, droughts, infectious diseases, unsustainable development, food and nutrition challenges, and threats to livelihoods and our traditional ways of life. These challenges go hand in hand with agricultural challenges and the difficulties farmers often have getting safe, nutritious food into markets due to disasters and hazards, and now competition from cheap imported food that is slowly becoming a catastrophe of a different kind. The climate emergency alone has negatively impacted agriculture and has led to declining availability of arable land and declining crop yields. Our region today is constantly fighting a rear guard action against these continual threats. There is often little time to make long-term plans due to the constant disruptions of the environment. And many governments in this region, immediate actions to save lives are not always sustainable. Long-term planning is really unattainable for many of our small island nations. So Pacific communities' relationships with nature is changing. Forests are being felled, biodiversity is being lost, and the tiny and precious amount of land our small island states in the Pacific do have is often not managed with a view toward future generations. And we are trying to get this better. So although our starting point looks bleak, it's not one that can't be managed. We are, as a region, learning to embrace science, technology, innovation, tradition, and flexibility to ensure our small nations achieve big ambitions. We know we must be proactive in anticipating what's coming. And quite simply, the Pacific needs to become global leaders in adaptation and adaptation. So we do have the resources in place. Organizations like the Pacific Community, our regional scientific organization, they are already working to pool our knowledge and expand our scientific expertise and to help us prepare for the future. We as a community in the region feel like we must tap into the big thoughts of our small populations to blend tradition with modernization if we are to thrive in a post-COVID, politically dynamic and climate-driven world. My second point and I want to spend a few minutes talking about, is the importance of the relationship between nutrition, health, and sustainable livelihoods. Today, Pacific communities are drowning in an ever-encroaching sea of cheap imported food that often has lower nutritional value than traditional foods. Though growing urban populations and changing diets will require some food imports, research has shown the substantial increases of imported non-traditional foods have been linked to an increase in non-communicable diseases, including diabetes, a condition that requires good nutrition to be managed. And today, the Pacific is globally known for having the highest rates of mortality due to non-communicable diseases and some of the highest rates of obesity in the world. We have the challenge of both poor nutrition and malnutrition in our children, with some countries having high levels of stunting in our adolescents, and of increasing concern is anemia in our younger women. So this is a double-edged sword for many of our communities, and all of this requires good nutrition to manage many of these conditions. The truth is that the Pacific food production is still currently insufficient to supply the amount of fruits and non-starchy vegetables required for good human health. Nutrition security has to be at the heart of many of our efforts, and there is ample room for new ideas and thinking about how to embed local production and nutrition, behaviour change, through school feeding, for example, and many more. And in regional food production, we must ensure every aspect of getting a plant or animal from the farm to the table is viable, from the seed to the crop to market, and of course down to the very building blocks of this food, its genetic resources. I'm really, really heartened, and many of you will know the partners of the Land Resources Division, but we do have a long-time ally and a deep expertise in these food building blocks, genetics and seeds. And this ally is in the Centre for Pacific Crops and Trees, CPACT. A key area of their work is improving planting material, where they conserve and make available different crops and genetic material for the region. And more importantly, exploring food options for different and future climatic conditions. There is no doubt the Pacific will indeed need different varieties of food as we face further climatic conditions, such as drought. And we will need food that is drought tolerant and food that is more salt tolerant as we face sea level rise. I'm really delighted to see the CPAC's leader and head of the Pacific Communities Land Resources Division and Genetic Resources Program, Longa Wanganibete. Talofa Longa, and you are here with us tonight. And Longa has been responsible really more for than a decade, ensuring that the Pacific has a fruitful and robust base of agricultural crops and trees. And this year, CPACT won the 2022 Island Innovation Award for Innovative Island Research. So well done to you, Longo. The importance of regional food systems has really been brought home thanks to COVID-19, as many economies closed and markets have become difficult to access over the past 2 years. Add in the impact of globalization and the war in Ukraine recently, the vulnerability of Pacific agriculture has become so much more obvious. But the Pacific is not blind to this, and not blind to this particular vulnerability, and is already taking steps to meet these challenges. Last year, the Pacific community led a series of online food systems dialogues in the lead up to the inaugural UN International Food Summit. The Pacific dialogues not only led to the regional representation and supported a coordinated regional voice at the International Summit, but it also laid the groundwork for the Pacific community's flagship Food Systems Program. This initiative is a prime example of governments, community groups, NGOs, research agencies, business and development partners coming together to act for a future of hardy and resilient food systems that will feed our communities. And I thank the many partners involved in supporting this work. An exciting initiative underway that will have region-wide impact is the integrated program managed also by the Pacific community on the coconut. And we call the coconut in the Pacific the tree of life. And it is called the tree of life because every part of the coconut, the entire tree, from top to bottom, are used to sustain human life. It really has to be the most useful tree in the world. However, it is under threat. The rhinoceros beetle is a major pest to the coconut and has to date devastated coconut growth and production in many small islands. So this year, a coconut risk management and mitigation manual released earlier in the year covers risks from seed to consumption, including climate change, planting, pests and diseases, policy, technology, post-harvest, marketing, and essentially cultural habits. The coconut and its fruits are ingrained in part of Pacific culture, and this targeted initiative will go a long way in ensuring this culture and the livelihoods it supports will remain strong. And again, I want to acknowledge the work of ACIAR and DFAT for their scientific support in this. So every step we are taking is ensuring that the Pacific has a sustainable, regionally based health food system. It will be a step towards better and more secure livelihoods, and most importantly, our efforts must be at the heart of a nutritionally safer environment. There is arguably no region on Earth in which the connections between the green and the blue economy are so intertwined, and this relationship is my third point. Agriculture is the green of the blue-green economy, but we cannot leave out the blue, the ocean, and the food and nutrition it provides. Agriculture and fishing are not just sources of food, they are vital for livelihoods. Across the Pacific, more than 50 to 70% of the people depend on agriculture and fishing for their livelihoods. For most small nations, as well as our large island nations, we have the necessity of farmers who fish. And we also have fishers that farm. And that reality must shape our approach to Pacific agriculture. The blue-green Pacific economy is facing both slow shocks, such as deteriorating water quality, water availability, deterioration of coastal ecosystems, degraded soils, loss of plant genetic diversity, and we have rapid shocks which include extreme climate events. We are seeing much more now, as a result of climate, increases in invasive plant pests and animal diseases. And of course, we have this constant economic disruption from pandemics and other such global events. But it's important to remember that these shocks are cumulative, and the climate-related ones are forecast to be more frequent and more extreme. The blue-green economy means evolving not only our food systems, but our relationship with food, so that we can capture and emancipate a very powerful means to realize the climate-resilient societies and the climate-resilient food systems that the Pacific needs. Consider for a moment the challenge faced by atoll nations such as Kiribati. Limited soil, a narrow biodiversity base, access to fresh water very difficult. And here we see mostly fishers that farm. And the changing climate is slowly swallowing the scarce amount of land that is available. What they require are new ways to integrate ridge and reef systems, so land and reef systems, as well as investments in multi-sectorial disciplines that harness multiple stakeholders to collaborate on tackling planning challenges that often span more than one sector, but support local communities. A real concern in the region related to food sources in the blue economy is, of course, fish. which are the region's greatest source of protein. It is our largest source of protein. But our fish are being impacted by ocean warming and are migrating away from their historic territories. And the result of this have been that fishermen's livelihoods have been impacted, and therefore the availability of our traditional sources of protein are severely disrupted. So the time is right to better support these nations with our resources and our technology to find new ways to feed their communities. And the land resources team in the region, for example, are working with their partners on adapting the new food cube technology. And I thought I'd share this with you. And this is the new food cube technology for atoll nations. A trial in Tuvalu has been investigated on whether gardens could be established using only on-island resources. And trials such as this will be extended to Kiribati and, of course, various parts of the region. And we will pair this with trainings on how to use the technology. It's a very new innovation for us. However, we must be careful that these new technologies, in addition to the current technologies and coastal food systems in place, do not damage delicate coastal fisheries. Land-based agriculture should complement or support sea-based food harvesting, just as sea-based harvesting should complement land-based harvesting. A good example of this is the research currently done by the government of Fiji in bacterium fertilizer, for example, made from local resources, which supports soil health and crop productivity while protecting coastal ecosystems and fisheries from hazardous runoff with conventional inputs. And these components of the food system will clearly be key to realizing these blue and green economies in the Pacific. We really do have to ensure that they are progressive and adaptable so that we can serve the different needs and environments of both the region's volcanic nations as well as its atoll nations. My fourth point is on the critical importance of weaving traditional knowledge with modern science and technology. A blue-green technology for a blue-green economy must be driven by new thinking and new tools for new times. But the old agricultural knowledge, traditions, and culture that have fed Pacific peoples, supported them and their communities for generations cannot be left aside. This weaving of tradition and technology is the only way forward for a Pacific that has been swept up into the tides of rapid world transformation and modernization. Sadly, many of our traditional knowledge and customs in the Pacific are being lost to modernization, but we are increasingly discovering that they may hold the key for our agricultural future. For centuries, Pacific peoples have survived on our small, remote islands through intimate knowledge of not only the surrounding seas, but also the generous land. Our island countries are small, and their lands and soils are not always rich, particularly our atoll nations. But our communities have always found a way to feed their citizens. So though traditional knowledge and customs are vital for the future of Pacific agriculture, it is also true that this sector cannot realize progress without merging them with modern science and technology. The pace of science is continuing to accelerate worldwide. And as a result of globalization and knowledge interconnectivity, but too often our region has been left out of international research efforts. A bit like the Europeans exploring maps of old, blank spaces represent the Pacific. There be dragons. How can we ensure that the deep and invaluable knowledge locked in the Pacific can become part of the global knowledge base? One answer is to ensure that Pacific researchers and scientists are publishing in more peer-reviewed journals and other science-based outlets. We really need the Pacific to become part of the conversation. The uniqueness of our agricultural challenges can and should lead to unique scientific breakthroughs. One of these breakthroughs is in plant health. Plant health on farms and in agroforestry projects is vital for our communities. Our native and farm species are also undergoing threats, and without plant health, there simply will not be enough food to feed our communities. There has been a focus on plant health in the region for several years now. Farmers have been trained through plant health clinics, and this training is now widely available and now also online. A new app was recently introduced for farmers to diagnose plant disease and other issues, and to get help from experts when needed to stop a scourge that could destroy an entire crop. And in April this year, regional partners teamed up with Manaki Whenua, which is land care research in New Zealand, to open a new molecular laboratory in Fiji that will offer a pathogen diagnostic and genotyping service to the region. It is a start, but these breakthroughs will not happen if our small island nations do not collaborate and receive support from our large regional partners. So I ask, as science and research progresses in the Pacific, why is our aid lagging and our agricultural models outdated? There is currently a lack of investment in scaling, and most importantly, we need a broader regional research agenda that not only provides support, but builds capacity for agricultural research in the region so that Pacific people themselves can innovate using their own knowledge and skills. The good news is that the Australian government has started to recognise the problem, and this year ACIAR has partnered with the Pacific community on a Pacific regional research agenda. The agenda is currently under development and will be presented to the annual Pacific Heads of Agriculture and Forestry meeting due to take place in Fiji in November. And I trust you will join us to ensure this vital initiative gets off the ground and plays an important role in Pacific agriculture's future. Although this may sound like a new initiative, ACIAR has been a long and solid trusted partner in the region for some time and have been working with many research partners to build and strengthen core research capacity. Assisting many of them to build core scientific capacity, the goal has to be ultimately that we are collectively working together to strengthen coordinated research mechanisms across the region, as well as build that capacity. This is a topic I know that is close to the heart of the Crawford Fund. So the science and technology communities really do need to work hand in hand with traditional knowledge practitioners to finding unique and relevant solutions to our unique and relevant agricultural challenges. But we need those solutions to travel beyond the lab and beyond the village. We need solutions that are extensive and adaptable as the Pacific region itself, that are not reductionist in approach, but recognise and work with the whole system. So my fifth flag post, it takes a village. And this is about inclusive and comprehensive action. Our efforts, solutions, and advances must be available and relevant in all Pacific Island countries for all its peoples. We cannot prosper agriculturally now and in the future without bringing gender and underserved communities into the conversation. Welcoming and supporting all is the only path to success. Women, of course, make a large contribution to Pacific economies. In places such as the Solomon Islands, women are responsible for 90% of the activity in the Honiara Central Market. In Samoa, 80% of the private sector comprises of micro businesses, and women are estimated to head over 40% of those. Clearly, the Pacific cannot find success in agriculture or with any sustainable development initiative without including women, youth, and other underserved communities. They drive the economies and provide much of our food. Their workdays are often double workdays as they combine responsibilities for home and family with their economic activities. Attitudes and cultures towards the contribution of women and youth are shifting, but in order to shift into a plentiful post-COVID agricultural future, we need to do more to ensure that they are empowered and recognised for their invaluable contributions. There are some fantastic examples already in place. DFAT, of course, is funding the Building Prosperity for Women project that is managed by Poetcom. Building prosperity for women producers and processors and women-owned businesses. And we have many initiatives in Palau, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, Kiribati and Ponape, helping women to participate in organic value chains and, importantly, decision-making processes. Women are gaining increased financial independence and benefiting from organic value chains, which are helping, of course, to increase food security. These types of projects will increase gender equitable policies and practice in the region. There is the project called Pacific Women Lead, again funded by DFAT, which will see a greater focus on women in the Pacific, leading on agricultural initiatives. And in Fiji, a really interesting project, in the village of Nandramai on Fiji's largest island, Viti Levu, women have taken the reins of an agroforestry project that has prospered in the wake of COVID. They have planted trees to improve biodiversity and help stem the impacts of climate change in their village. And this in turn has led to a plant nursery where seedlings are sold to benefit the community. The project and its collective knowledge is also being passed on to the next generation. Many of the village daughters came home from the tourist resorts in which they worked due to COVID shutdowns. And the Nandramai women taught their daughters their growing methods. And young girls are now interested in their work, carrying on tradition, whilst also bringing their own education and knowledge back to benefit their families and the community. When we pass these traditions to youth, everyone succeeds. So these stories tell us that women can lead in our post-COVID agricultural future, and we need to foster and support more examples like the Nandramai and the Women Producers project in Micronesia throughout the Pacific. So the 5 elements I have highlighted this evening are all essential for the future of agriculture in the Pacific. But I really want to emphasize that these and other efforts should not be looked at like a menu of choices. We cannot decide to deal with one area and leave the rest for another time. They are all interconnected. Failure to fund and invest in one area will inevitably bring down the rest. A holistic and integrated approach to all investments is essential for sustainability. The diversity of the Pacific means that one agriculture, meaning we use the same model for every country, will be challenging, but our approach to agriculture throughout the region cannot be successful without putting one health approach into practice. Some of the projects I have mentioned tonight are already doing this, but it is clear we need more education, more knowledge, more collaboration, more bold ideas, and more resources from our partners in Australia and beyond. But we have momentum now. The spirits are high as the fever of agriculture and development in the Pacific is reigniting post-COVID. And many old projects are back online and new projects are sprouting quickly. Our region is big, so I think we need to think big. While we work to regrow our agricultural communities in the next few years, post-COVID, I think we can think about what we can achieve in 5 years, what we can do in 10 years, and even the next 30 years, and commit to our farmers in the Pacific to ploughing only healthy soil in 2050. Soil that is rich in tradition, watered by knowledge and technology, and bound together by community. We can support our region by thinking about climate-resilient food systems, climate-smart agricultural production. It is possible, but only if we collectively make comprehensive, consistent investments with your knowledge and resources, but also with your ideas, your ambition, and your commitment. The recognition of the role of women and youth is now being integrated into the narrative of our cultural traditions and progress. New projects, technology, grounded in traditional knowledge are now taking shape. The Pacific is increasingly being heard on the world stage. This is the time, the opportunity to reimagine and renew our call for agricultural resiliency throughout the region and to recognise and support the role agriculture can play in regenerating our ecosystems and economies. So I urge all of you, all of us, to not let these many opportunities pass. Reimagining, rejuvenating agriculture and food systems in the Pacific. The potential in our region is really quite boundless. And with your collaboration, I think we can start to build the farms and markets of tomorrow today. And DFAT's Partnerships for Recovery, COVID-19 Development Response is really a good step forward. We can turn the Pacific's thorny and increasing rooted challenges into an opportunity. Thriving agricultural seeds One Health, and One Health seeds a radiant future for this region. Finally, can I say thank you most sincerely for listening to me this evening. I am indeed, of course, looking forward to a future where we are all fed and valued. In fact, I think we have already taken the first step. We have already put shovel to soil. We've dropped in the seed of collaboration and innovation and watered it, and now I think we just need to help it sprout and grow. May I thank again our host, the Crawford Fund, and you, the agricultural community of Australia and beyond, and I look forward to the events tomorrow. Vinaka Vakalevu, thank you and good evening.
The Honourable John Anderson and Crawford Fund colleagues, honourable members and former members of the Houses of Parliament of Australian governments, senior leaders of government and agricultural research organisations of Australia and the region, Mrs Fiona Simpson and fellow commissioners and colleagues from ACIAR, ladies and gentlemen. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and acknowledge emerging leaders. I also acknowledge any elders or First Nations people with us tonight, either in the room or in the many countries that are joining with us. It's my pleasure to rise on your behalf to thank Dr. Audrey Aumua for agreeing to address us and for her insightful and challenging words. We've been privileged to share the wealth of experience and perspectives Audrey's brought to her signposts of the road ahead for small islands and developing states. I just want to remind you where those insights are derived from Audrey's academic interests in policy and strategy, especially for health and development, from her roles, as you heard earlier, including the Solomon Post for the WHO, and as a senior leader in SPC addressing food, nutrition and agricultural research outcomes, as well as dealing with how to improve resilience in the face of natural disasters and climate change. From her current role as CEO for the Fred Hollows Foundation. I thought of this when I thought of the metaphor of signposts. Of course, you need vision to be able to see those signposts. And the Fred Hollows Foundation doesn't just provide clinical interventions to protect sight, it also has a very strong emphasis on supporting local expertise and institutional capacity. Audrey also brings to tonight's talk her experience as a senior Pacific woman working within local culture to engage all the community voices and contributions that are important to discussion of the path forward. And as we ACIAR commissioners saw recently when we were travelling with Audrey on ACIAR's visit in Vietnam, Audrey's a colleague who's prepared to go the extra mile. We had very little spare time because ACIAR likes to get its pound of flesh. But in the few free moments she had in Hanoi, she ducked off to do a little job for the Fred Hollows Foundation Vietnam. And in the remaining few minutes, and probably some that she really technically didn't have, she ducked off to find presents for her grandchildren. Always important to be that well-rounded member of the Pacific community. So Audrey, we know that an address such as we've heard tonight is built on your years of learning and on many hours of preparation. You've given us a timely challenge to work towards integrated and tailored solutions, starting with where the Pacific agriculture is. You've pointed out that the diverse people of the Pacific are coming out of the disruptions of COVID but face impacts of changing climate. The global spotlight is truly on the many challenges faced by the people of the Pacific in their struggle for resilience in a globally connected and challenged world. You've highlighted how agriculture, diet and health intersect with climate change impacts and the natural resource constraints Pacific people face, along with the economic and political complexities that lead to a necessity for long-term planning for food systems that provide sustainable nutrition for all. And you've reminded us of another great connection in the lives of people of the Pacific Island continent, the interconnected green and blue economies. You've highlighted the need to partner together traditional knowledge and technology, an important theme that I think we're still coming to grips with in Australian land and sea management, and that it takes a village, that we need to include all, especially women and youth, in the decisions, strategies and actions on the path forward together, aided and supported by partners from Australia and New Zealand and from across the region who can provide resources and help to grow local research, technology and business capacity to do the scaling out. On that topic of diversity, I thought to myself as I watched, I'm not sure whether in 35 years the Crawford Foundation's had one grandmother getting up to offer the vote of thanks to another grandmother. But it's a great demonstration of diversity and I think something that we want to continue to encourage. So thank you for sharing your perspectives with us in a speech which truly honours the 35th anniversary of the Crawford Fund and the vision of Sir John Crawford, of Australians partnering in agricultural science and research to work with the scientists, leaders and communities of our region for our mutual benefit. Now, I know you've all got knife and fork in hand, but can I ask you just to join me one more time to thank Audrey for an outstanding address to set the scene for the Crawford Fund 2022 conference.